Well, we're rolling, sir, and it's time for this week's podcast intro. Kick it off.
We got pretty serious in this program
Well,
because
we did and we didn't.
We're looking at Jefferson's letters from France. These what he learned in France letters.
Well, it's the 101 series, and
113, I think.
we're up to 113, and we decided at your request, said we need to do one more on the
What he learned.
Jefferson in Paris. What he learned in Paris, and look at some of the letters he wrote to Mr. Madison. And then you just kind of went off.
Oh, that's not true.
It's true.
I'm taking him seriously. Jefferson
You raised your voice a number of times, sir.
Because you, sir, were saying, "Oh, it's easy to live on the minimum wage."
You know what? I'm going to get beat up for that. I'm just, I don't think, God, I can't imagine living on a minimum wage. I just can't imagine it. But there are people who do it, and I mean, I'm not going to point any fingers here, but there's a lot of us in America right now who probably have it, we spend a lot of money on ourselves.
I buy a lot of pistachios.
Add up cell phones, cable, all that kind of stuff. I mean, you can't live without a cell phone. You can't live without cable. Yeah, but, so.
Yeah, well, you're one of the haves, aren't you?
I am.
We're the haves. Easy for us to talk this way.
Yeah.
Easy.
I'm not. You've told me I live pretty Jeffersonian.
You are very Thoreauvian.
I hold on to that. With
I love that about you.
A flag of pride.
If anyone could do it, you could, as a voluntary poverty of the sort that Thoreau is talking about. But let me go back to the point. God bless Thomas Jefferson for raising these questions.
I wouldn't want to give up my guitars.
So take me seriously here. Who in our current political pantheon, the 16 Republicans and the 4 or 5 Democrats who...
Oh, Bernie.
Bernie.
Absolutely.
Is asking those questions.
Bernie came to Bismarck. I went and heard him speak. You did not.
No, I didn't.
It was fabulous. He's a great guy. I'd vote for him in a heartbeat.
So you agree that he is raising these questions?
I do, and I he's one of those just quickly, he's one of those candidates you don't even care what all of his positions are because he's so genuine.
Okay, so he raised these questions.
Right.
He did not win, although he gave Mrs. Clinton a good run for her money. What happens to his passion and the passion of the millions of people who were caught by those ideas of economic justice? What happens next?
I will tell you.
You tell me.
First off, I think there's a real problem with a lot of Bernie supporters that are the Bernie or bust people.
Right.
Because Bernie Sanders has been in politics how many decades? I can't tell you exactly.
Okay, he's not an outsider.
Yeah, and he understands, he's an independent too, and he hangs on to that mantle proudly. He understands the difference between activism, raising public awareness, and the actual sausage making of politics.
Okay, what happens to the public awareness that he has helped to raise?
I really think once the election is completed, it'll be clearer what he's going to do. But I think, he's at an age where
but what happens to the movement that he's part of?
I think he's going to hang on to it and use it to affect future legislation.
You think there will be reform legislation about the 1%?
I think
there
already has been. I think there already has been. I think his effect on the Democratic platform was.
My view is that the party establishment is just trying to outlast him and go back to...
Oh, you're such a cynic.
I'm not a cynic.
You are.
I'm not a cynic.
Yes, you are.
No. You saw him at the convention.
Yeah.
You saw him looking at Mrs. Clinton, and he was thinking what I'm saying. That she's not going to do it. She's not going to enact any part of my real program. That's the look he was giving her, is that she has co-opted the movement to a certain degree, and she's going to betray it, and we're not going to get any real distance towards social justice.
Well, sir, we will have to. We will have to wait and see what happens. But I disagree with you.
Well, I hope you're right and I'm wrong. I'll tell you what.
Then there's the other side of things.
What's that?
The Republican parts.
Well, Donald Trump has also tapped into the angst, frustration, anger, rage of America.
I should point out that we're recording this several weeks before the conventions. It's going to broadcast after the conventions. Due to your schedule, you do your annual trek to Montana.
Heroic.
Uh-huh. And, we don't know what's going to happen.
Wow. Now, let me ask you this. Do you like to watch meteor showers?
I do.
The Perseid meteor shower, August 12th, is the highlight. I found out this weekend that there is a lawn chair called the Gravity Chair.
Yes.
Sells for around $50.
Uh-huh.
You can recline so that you are 100% prone, to look at stars in perfect comfort. This weekend I was looking at stars. There was a pretty good meteor shower, and I was craning my neck. It was a chiropractic nightmare. There is this chair called the gravity chair that you must have for the Perseids.
Designed for those living on minimum wage, I'll bet.
I knew you were going there. You could.
I'm just awful this week. I
You know what?
apologize.
Why are you so perverse? Here's
Politics.
David, my friend, my dear friend, in the history of our relationship, which
Yes.
is a long and lovely and fruitful history,
Oh,
you have almost always been the radical, and I have almost always tried to bring it down and take it to the center and be more moderate. And then suddenly, I'm finally on board and saying, Jefferson's raising the question of the 1%, and you're saying, you're really all hepped up this week, sir.
I'll tell you what. Let's go.
Is that true?
Yeah, so bad.
What's going on here?
I think we need to take this conversation
I
elsewhere
want
and let the listeners
public decide.
go to the show. Yeah.
And I ask each of you as you listen to this show,
Oh, geez, I'm going to get beat up.
calculate your living wage and let us know what you think that is, and then calculate what your life would look like if, and it hasn't happened yet, we enacted a national minimum wage at about $16 per hour. So calculate that as you listen to Mr. Jefferson, the radical from France, talking about what can go wrong in an otherwise lovely society. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, brought to you by Bismarck State College on the banks of the Missouri River at the heart of the Lewis and Clark Trail.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm David Swenson, your host, and across from me is the gentleman who created the Thomas Jefferson Hour and the gentleman who portrays President Thomas Jefferson, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And I believe we're at Jefferson 113, and at the end of 112, which was the second show about Jefferson in Paris, you said we need to do one more, and we need to talk about what Jefferson learned in France and about some of the key letters he wrote to Madison. So welcome.
It's great to be here. I've just been reading, again, the chapters in Joseph Ellis's book, American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, about his time in Europe. Ellis is a great historian and biographer. If our listeners have never had a chance to read one of his many books, many of them award-winning, I suggest that they start either with Passionate Sage, which is about John Adams, or with American Sphinx, which is about Thomas Jefferson. Ellis is probably the greatest scholar of the American Revolution of our time. He certainly has written the most, in my opinion, insightful and interesting books about that era.
When we talked about doing this show, Clay, you pointed me to look at some key letters written to Madison. And these were really anything to do with Paris. Mostly they were advice because the Constitution was being written. There was one, however, that talked about the peasants.
Right. So what happened was that Jefferson goes to France. He's grieving for his wife, Martha, who died at the age of 33. He's had essentially a nervous breakdown. Madison, his closest friend, they're not deep friends yet, but they're very good friends. Madison intercedes with Congress and says, you've been wanting to send Jefferson to Europe for one purpose or another, and he's always turned it down. I think if you send him now, he may well accept the commission because he's grieving, and it would be better for him to get out from under the kind of malaise at Monticello, where everything reminds him of his wife. And so Congress dutifully appointed Jefferson to be a minister plenipotentiary to European courts, to be stationed in Paris and to work with John Adams, who later became the first American ambassador to England, and with Dr. Franklin, who was effectively America's ambassador to the world. Jefferson was to work with them to create ideal commercial treaties and to push forward the principle of free trade in these mercantilist and protectionist European states. And so Jefferson arrives in France in the end of the summer of 1784 and stays until November of 1789. And Madison was right. He does recover. He regains his essential optimism and his energy and productivity, and he falls in love with Maria Cosway, the Italian-British painter, and he sees the French Revolution coming. and he becomes America's first great wine connoisseur by traveling through the wine country of France and taking very extensive notes and negotiating with wine merchants and vignerons and so on. It's a really productive period. It consolidates his life as an architect, and he helps to shape the Capitol at Richmond. He hires Houdon, the great French sculptor, the greatest sculptor in the world, to come to the United States to measure George Washington and to take masks of Washington's face so that he can produce this extraordinary pedestrian statue of Washington that now rests in the cupola in the rotunda of the state capitol of Virginia at Richmond. This is a very fertile, remarkable period in Jefferson's life, pivotal really. But during that period, as he watches the coming of the French Revolution, David, he sees to his horror that an amiable people on a fertile patch of ground can have their civilization collapse. It's what in the 21st century we called a failed state. He watches France become a failed state and then go through the convulsions of the great French Revolution, and Jefferson's observing this. This is a mirror being held up to America, and he's observing this and asking, why did this happen? Is there any parallel that can be drawn between what's happening in France and what might happen later in American history? Are there things we should be attending to as a people so that this will not happen? Are there ways of national renewal? Are there red flags that are going up that I can carry back with me to the United States and try to make sure that we fine-tune our constitutional system so that this will never, ever happen to us? And what are the roots of this? What are the dynamics of the French Revolution? What are really the insoluble problems that the French Revolution is attempting to wrestle with? And is there a peaceful alternative to bread riots and the guillotine and armed revolution in the streets? So Jefferson takes this very seriously. He doesn't. Most Americans just look on this as Europe. It's something that couldn't happen here. It's old world stuff. They turn away from the French Revolution in disgust. Jefferson, to his credit, turns toward the French Revolution and tries to read it, tries to interpret it, tries to take lessons from it. And the way he processed this was letters to his closest friend, James Madison. And these were, I think, among the most important letters that Jefferson ever wrote. And the conclusion of which is that when he came back to the United States in the late autumn of 1789, he had been deepened in his revolutionary principles. He had been radicalized in ways that he had not been radicalized from books and the intellectual discourse of the United States leading up to our own revolution. He was confirmed that there are some pitfalls that we must not let ourselves be drawn into. And so he tried a set of trial balloons in these very philosophical and reflective letters to Madison to see if he could enlist his closest friend in the same set of deep concerns that he had gained from observing France fall apart. So that's the basis of all of this.
You were referring, I think, to the October 1785 letter, the one that starts 7 o'clock and retired to my fireside. I've determined to enter into conversation with you.
That's you can see that this is a formal preface. Take this seriously, Mr. Madison.
And I thought it was a pretty unusual letter. I don't know how to say unusual, but not a typical Jefferson letter. This reflective beginning, I just love that.
He likes this idea that he's the solitary traveler in the European world, and that because he's traveling effectively incognito without a retinue of retainers and valets and coachmen and postilions and so on.
By the fire, I have decided to enter into conversation with you. It's lovely.
Imagine being James Madison and receiving this letter. And
you would read it.
You would read it so carefully.
And before we go away from Madison, if I can just interject for listeners, I suspect we'll talk much more about Madison in future Jefferson 101 series, but I think it's important that people recognize, even though they weren't close friends at this time, they were neighbors.
They lived 30 miles apart.
30 miles apart, and that world was a neighbor, right?
Indeed, and they had met actually over a horse incident, a horse purchase thing, and then they found that they shared a deep commitment to a wall of separation between church and state. So the first glue of their friendship was a shared view that government must be absolutely neutral on questions of the human conscience and on religion, and that government should not favor this or that religion. Government should not tax us for religious purposes. Government should not compel us to attend religious services. Government should not punish us if we're Catholics or Muslims or Jews or Presbyterians. That government is something that delivers the mail and protects our coasts and harbors and so on, but government does not have any authority in the heart or in the conscience. Government is about overt acts, but not about attitudes or about our best thinking about whether there is a God, and if so, what form that being takes, and so on. They agreed on this. This is 1776. They come together on this, and this becomes their first great achievement. Jefferson writes the Virginia Statute for religious liberty, and he goes off to Europe. The House of Delegates in Virginia doesn't like it, and it votes it down year after year. Madison, who agrees with this principle maybe even more strongly than Jefferson, sees it through the really hard work of the legislative process. And finally, in 1786, it's passed into law in the House of Delegates in Virginia, and Madison is able to send the news to his great friend and mentor that the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty is now the official law of the state of Virginia. And that bill, the second of the three things Jefferson wished to be remembered for on his tombstone, is arguably Jefferson's greatest single achievement. And you think of the list of Jefferson's achievements, but he took deep pride in disestablishing the Church of England and creating what he later would characterize as, quote, a wall of separation between church and state.
Well, I didn't mean to get you off track, but I did think it was important. For me, it's important to understand the basis of their relationship. And even though it was early on in their, as you said, in their relationship, reading this letter gives you a clue to where it's headed. It was fairly well established, their friendship and their shared beliefs and values and stuff, because it's an extraordinary letter.
They're neighbors, they're friends, they both are plantation owners, slaveholders, they both love horses, they both love to read. Madison is, if anything, an even deeper student of the history of politics and the liberal arts than Thomas Jefferson.
And Jefferson's in Paris, and he's learning.
And he's lonely. He's lonely, and he wants to try out these new ideas and new observations on someone he can implicitly trust. If you sent this letter to John Adams, he's going to mark it up and quarrel with you at every point and quibble and rewrite it and tell you you're naive and that he taught you everything you know. With Madison, Jefferson knew he would get a deeply respectful hearing, but not an uncritical one.
But they were confidants.
They were confidants, and they often wrote in code. They often used a cipher when they were writing about sensitive information, so that if the postmasters or somebody opened the letters, they couldn't read the most sensitive exchanges that they were making. And Jefferson devised this code and gave copies of the cipher wheel that he used to his closest friends, including Meriwether Lewis when he went up the Missouri River.
Well, as you can hear from the music, sir, we need to take a short break. But we'll continue this and perhaps go back to the letter.
We'll look at this letter.
Right. We'll be back in just a moment. You are listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation. Well, this week it's about President Thomas Jefferson. We're continuing our Jefferson 101 series, and actually we're up to Jefferson 113, the third show that we've done about Jefferson's time in Paris, which I must confess is one of my favorite periods to study. This week we're talking, you declared the subject for this week's show. We just talked about this particular letter where he was at Fontainebleau?
He'd go from time to time, go attend the king's levees at Fontainebleau, and he would travel through the countryside from Paris to Fontainebleau as he did so.
But what makes this letter so significant? Can you share that with us?
So Jefferson meets this woman, a peasant woman, on the road, and they walk together. He's asking her some directions, and they wind up walking together for a short distance. His French is not great, but it's good enough to talk.
Well, when you say a peasant, sir, can you explain to people what that would have been in 1787?
This is a woman who is so poor that she struggles all of her life just to find enough pennies to put food on the table for herself and her two children, that there's no surplus, there's no discretionary money. She has to work every single day just to buy enough bread to keep her family alive, and if she gets sick, there's no social safety net. This is people living on not just on the edge of poverty, but on the edge of malnutrition and with some fear of starvation. That's what we're talking about. So he meets her, and they walk along, and he likes to do this, and he asks her some questions about her life, and how much do you get paid, and where do you live, and what kind of house do you live in, and so on. How many children do you have? And so then he says that as they parted, she tells him that she earns 8 sous a day, so just pennies a day. That's her wage for the kind of day labor that she does in the fields. And when they part, Jefferson gives her 24 sous, so he gives her effectively 3 days' wages. So that today would be, $1,000 for many people. She bursts into tears, and he says that she had an unfeigned gratitude, that she couldn't even believe that this perfect stranger had given her 3 days' worth of wages. So then Jefferson says, all right, Mr. Madison, let's think about this for a minute. Why is she poor? Is she poor because she is lazy? Is she poor because she's stupid? Is she poor because she's made bad choices? Or is she poor because there is a bad system of economics in place in France that enables a handful of people to live with almost unbelievable luxury and opulence, a puny little middle class, and then great masses, 15, maybe 19 million people, who are barely able to put food on the table? And he says, is this natural? If it's not a moral failing, and she's not lazy, and she's not stupid, and she's willing to work, how did it come about that somebody, an able-bodied, willing person, is nearly starving to death? Is this going to happen to us? Is it inevitable that if you deal the cards out, that after a certain amount of time, a handful of people control almost everything, and the 1% we speak of today in the United States in the time of Bernie Sanders, and that the mass of people don't have anything? Is that natural? And let's just say that we don't agree let's just say we all agree that this is bad. It's not okay that 1% control most things and the majority have almost nothing. Let's say we can agree on that. Now what? How do you fix it? How do you fix it so that there's a more equitable distribution of the fruits and opportunities and emoluments of life? What's the mechanism? Because what Jefferson sees coming is armed revolution. The French Revolution is going to be a cataclysm, a nightmare. Do you wait until it gets so bad that the people finally take their pitchforks into the streets and start slaughtering the innocent? Or is there something a country can do, a government, a social contract that we all agree to, that avoids the guillotine and street riots and the storming of the Bastille that finds some peaceful alternative, but it still works. It still creates the conditions under which people who want to work and people who want to thrive in some minimal sense can thrive. That's the question. David, that question has not been answered. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
That question
I do.
has not been answered. So America says, we do not want communism or socialism. They're failed. All right, fair enough, if that's your view. So then what's the answer? What's the answer to the fact that there really is a 1% in America that controls an enormous amount of the power and the industry and the economy of this country, the best real estate, the finest second, third, 15th homes, the finest cars, the finest education for their children, go on any journey anywhere in the world, when the mass of people are living not hand to mouth. That's not America. We're a land of abundance. But the mass of people struggle. Why is that? And what do you do about it is the question.
First off, I would say, I have some Jefferson questions I want to get back to, but just quickly I would say, because you asked me, I would say that I think in general terms, America is quite wealthy. We're how you put a relative term on that, I don't know. But we're not working for a few pennies a day. Those of us who are struggling are usually struggling not with where our next meal is going to come from, but how we're going to do everything we want.
We struggle at a higher level of material prosperity than almost any people who have ever lived.
Thank you for helping me. It's all relative.
But even so, the problem of maldistribution of the wealth of a nation is the problem that Jefferson's trying to address
And I
here.
agree. I don't think that's been solved, and it's an incremental change.
And the right wing likes to say, we're a land of opportunity. They're not clever enough. They're not creative enough. They're not working hard enough. They're not.
And the left wing likes to say, more government will fix
Right.
all
Well,
that.
we'll create a safety net. We'll do
Right.
training. We'll find ways. I'm not saying that either side is wrong or right. I'm saying that Jefferson is telling us you must attend to this problem. Mm-hmm. And let me give you his answer first.
Right.
But the consequences of this enormous inequality producing so much misery to the bulk of mankind, legislators cannot invent too many devices for subdividing property, only taking care to let their subdivisions go hand in hand with the natural affections of the human mind. So he's saying, if you don't want a French Revolution, then you'd better find a peaceful and enlightened mechanism to do this in some other way. In other words, if you wait long enough, someone will come through your door with a machete or a machine gun and take what they want from you. If you don't want that to happen, then you had better legislate a solution to this. And not everyone's going to be happy, but you've got to do it. And listen again to what he says. Subdivision means redistribution. He says, take care to let these redistributions, quote, go hand in hand with the natural affections of the human mind. This is what's wrong with Jefferson. He's sort of hoping that there's some magic wand that you can do that will make this appealing. But it isn't. When Mrs. Clinton in the 2016 election says we're going to tax the rich not because we hate them but because they have the money, you know they're not going to want that. The rich never want to give up what they have. Why should they?
Nobody does.
Nobody does. And so Jefferson's saying we got to find a mechanism that takes money from the 1%, but in some relatively benign and harmonious way. So here's what he says. Number one, you should have equal inheritance. So not primogeniture in which the eldest male child inherits everything, but you should have equal inheritance. He managed to get that done. But he says another means of silently lessening the inequality of property is to exempt all from taxation below a certain point, which we do. That's a part of the American tax code. And to tax the higher portions of property in geometrical progression as they rise.
A progressive tax.
A progressive property or income tax, which is what's done in a place like Sweden. In Sweden, everyone can earn $50,000 or $60,000 per year. Maybe it's $100,000, but if you earn 101, the tax rate goes up. If it's 110, it goes up steeply. If it's 150, it goes up dramatically. The idea is we're not going to let you, by social agreement, we're not going to let anyone be the 1%.
But that's really not what America has been.
But Jefferson says the only way to do it is to have a geometrical progression of tax so that the wealthiest people have a disincentive to amass unnecessarily obscene amounts of wealth.
In other words, I should say, that's really not what America has been during my adult lifetime. Perhaps there was a time when America was more
In the
like that.
1950s, we were more progressive. But here's what he would say today. And I'm not trying to sound like a Bernie Sanders person or anyone else, but he would say something like this. If you have 10 houses and 50 cars, you probably don't, quote unquote, need all of that if there are 30 million Americans who are on food stamps. Having one house is the American dream. Having 20 houses or 5 houses or a vacation home on a lake and another one in Arizona is probably not okay if there are millions of people who would work if they could and can't find labor in the economy and are not being paid a living wage, that we have to disincentivize obscene accumulations of wealth in order to enable something like a rough equality of circumstance for everyone.
Yeah, I'm with Jefferson completely on that.
But of course, this is crazy talk. If Mrs. Clinton said this would be the end of her candidacy.
What I was going to say is that I don't think the majority of Americans are. I think the majority of Americans want to have the possibility that they can get incredibly wealthy. That's what our system is built on. They don't want to give that up, along with a lot of other things they don't want to give up. Forgive me, I was in a national park last week, and I watched these bus-size RVs that kept their generators running all night.
So they can watch television in the park.
And have a giant SUV towed behind and maybe a four-wheeler behind it. And, okay, it's America. If that's what you choose to do with your fortune, you can do that. But I'm with Jefferson, and I say that unashamedly and unabashedly.
Well, so people can say we have this or that political bias or whatever, but I'm quoting Jefferson. Jefferson is saying that if the country's not ripe for everybody, it's really not ripe for anybody. And you must, if you don't want a French Revolution, you must find benign ways to redistribute opportunity in a great society.
So let's bring it back to Jefferson. And the question about Jefferson that I wanted to ask was, we were talking about his relationship with Madison. So I want your take on this. Was he exploring thought when he wrote this letter, or was it really a sign that living in Paris, living in France, witnessing the oncoming revolution had changed him that much?
It deepened him, I think. I think that he was shocked by what he saw because.
So it wasn't an experiment. He wasn't thinking out loud to see how it felt.
No, but let me explain. So he was horrified, and he writes these letters saying they're the politest people in the world. They're hardworking. The land is incredibly fertile here. He says, why? Why would this be the case that the 1% is probably 1/2 of 1% in France or 1/10 of 1%? Why did this happen, and how can we avoid it? But yes, he means this, that it's like big revolution or little revolution. Which one do you prefer? An enlightened legislative revolution, or do you want to wait for the riots in the streets? But, David, here's the thing. Jefferson's optimism is also at war with his realism. And so he thinks as long as we have the West, with a very capital W, and later I will purchase the Louisiana Territory, as long as we have that safety valve so that anyone who isn't getting a fair shake in Boston can go to Ohio, or if not Ohio, to Iowa, if not Iowa, to Colorado, if not Colorado, to Utah. In other words, as long as you have a frontier that's empty in the West, you solve the problem. You have hundreds of years of a safety valve that France doesn't have the luxury of having. They have what they have, and so you have to reshuffle the cards. Here, we can just dispossess the Indians, and suddenly we have millions and millions of new acres in the West. So it's a dodge. It's a Jefferson dodge, and it helps to explain the Louisiana Purchase. But to go back to your question, it's also a trial balloon. If Madison said to him,
that's what I wondered.
Very interesting, my dear sir, but have you thought that this might lead to this consequence, or it might, a revolution from the top, it might be a coup d'etat of officers and rich men? Jefferson, whenever Madison says to Jefferson, very interesting, my dear sir, it's a brilliant idea, but it attends certain consequences that you may not have fully thought through. then Jefferson almost always backs down. And remember,
Really, he does.
almost always. And remember, David, at no point in his life did Jefferson actually try to legislate this redistribution. It was too soon by hundreds of years for him because we had the West. At no point in his life did he actually attempt to do this. He's just saying, when you fill up like France and the nation is in collapse, you better have planned for that if you don't want the Bastille to be stormed.
So that's kind of where we're heading today.
There's an old sort of mechanism. People say that when 1% of the population owns something like 38% of the wealth, that's when you can trigger revolutions and so on. Now, America, as you say, has kind of been an exemption from that because the average guy living in Ritchie, Montana, or New Ulm, Minnesota, who doesn't have much, thinks, I could win the lottery. I could have an idea which suddenly makes me rich. I'm going to invent something.
That's part of the American dream.
Right. And so the counter-American dream is that you can convince 330 million people that they might get rich, and so they agree to let the rich stay rich, because if they got rich, they'd want to keep what they have. This is the source of the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? That you convince the great mass of Americans that they too might be of the elite, and so they'd better protect the elite, because if they ever got to be the elite, they wouldn't want some knucklehead in Montana taking it away from them.
There's a lot of that going on nowadays, and it's my job as the semi-permanent
guest host
to bring us back to Jefferson.
Wait, let me go back to the letter.
We got to, right.
Because it gets worse. Then Jefferson says, here in France, these aristocrats have these giant pleasure parks, David, of 50,000 acres or 200,000 acres that they just hunt a deer on from time to time. And listen to what he says. The earth is given as a common stock for men to labor and live on. If, for the encouragement of industry, we allow it to be appropriated, in other words, private property, we must take care that other employment be furnished to those excluded from that appropriation. If we do not, the fundamental right to labor the earth returns to the unemployed. It is too soon yet in our country to say that every man who cannot find employment but who can find uncultivated land shall be at liberty to cultivate it, paying a moderate rent. But it is not too soon to provide by every possible means that as few as possible shall be without a little portion of land. He is saying, if there is unused land, if Ted Turner has unused land in Montana and the people can't find work, they have a right to go jump the fence and grow their crops on that land. This is one of the leitmotifs of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, that here are these Okies who can't feed themselves, and there are these empty farms in California, and when they try to go onto those empty farms as their natural right, as Jefferson says, they're shot and killed by goons in the pay of the growers' associations. This is part of the radical agrarianism of American history, and Jefferson says, if you can't find work, it's not your fault if you are able-bodied and willing to work.
Wow.
That's quite a radical letter.
Pretty progressive.
And I'd say he never in his life attempted to legislate this. It's a trial balloon. But he's anticipating where we are right now when 1% controls the country and the masses, although they are doing pretty well, are deeply discontented with the way that the fruits of life are being made available and distributed in our economy.
As you can tell from the music, we need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You are listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson, or your weekly conversation about President Jefferson with the gentleman who created this show, the gentleman who is seated across from me now, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And, this is really interesting. We had started as a conversation about the Jefferson 101 series and Jefferson's time in France, and you had plotted out a conversation about what Jefferson learned in Paris and some of the great letters that he wrote to Madison. But this one particular letter, boy, it tells us a lot, doesn't it?
It does. It tells you this. So what did he learn in France? He learned that the stakes are incredibly high, and that if you do not really think about these questions in a serious and sober and robust way, that you are asking for a nightmare in your culture, that you have to face this question.
And here we are in 2016.
Not facing this question.
And the world is beginning to sort of unravel on us. And we could say there are just fringe things that are happening that I don't think either one of us have ever seen before.
Well, I want to, in a sense, move on, but I want to say this about this, David, that the Black Lives Matter movement is part of this same story. That if there is a widely held view that life works with different rules for different people on artificial bases, that's an unsustainable problem. That if you're African American in this country, you have to believe that your chances with law authorities are equal to those of your non-black neighbors. And if you believe that being black makes it more likely that you will die young in a police-related incident, that there is systemic racism in our law and order system, that it's not just about this person and that person, it's really about race, then you are not going to live with this in the long run until this gets sorted out, until we create the conditions under which everyone in the United States has an equal respect for our legal tradition. And so Jefferson is saying, attend to this thing. If you don't attend to this, you'll be sorry. You will be sorry if you don't, as an enlightened people, actually try to wrestle this thing to the ground and come up with a consensus about what the answer to it is. But living in denial, as did the aristocrats and the king in France, doesn't work out. The king lost his head. The aristocrats were decapitated by the guillotine, and their property was redistributed. It doesn't work out to be in denial. You have to face it. So that's what Jefferson is saying here. And so he comes back from France, and here's the astonishing thing, David. This country, the people here, Gouverneur Morris, George Washington, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, even Madison, had been moving in a conservative direction. They're in a counter-revolution. After the honeymoon of the American Revolution is over, they're thinking, oh, it's not looking as easy and utopian as it was going to. We may need some stronger social controls and a more conservative constitution. So Jefferson arrives back from France as this country is moving to the right, including his close friend Madison. He's been moving to the left. That's why he says in Philadelphia, when he's the Secretary of State, people would actually cross the street to avoid talking with him because he's now seen as a fiery, French-style Jacobin, read communist, that he's so radical now that he's out of sync with the people in the United States, including some of his closest friends. So that's one lesson he learned in France, which is you can get out of sync with your country really easily by sending up these trial balloons and taking them very seriously when your country, you haven't been in a position to bring them along with leadership at home. That's one thing. And here's another thing he learned in France, that what happens in France should stay in France. He falls in love with Maria Cosway. They have this lovely, wonderful, erotic flirtation and dance, whatever it was. She's married. She goes back to England. He writes the famous My Head and My Heart letter, and in it he said what he meant. Never snatch at the bait of pleasure till you know there is no hook beneath it. The art of happiness is the art of avoiding pain. What happens in France stays in France. That made sense there. It probably saved his emotional life. It was probably the deepest passion of his life. But when he crossed back to this country in 1789, it didn't make as much sense, and he began to distance himself from that era in his life and from her. There's a second lesson he learned. Another lesson he learned in France is that America is not taken very seriously in the rest of the world. That's not true today. Today, everyone has to take America seriously. But then America was regarded by the people that he met in France as sort of Nicaragua or Guatemala. We've heard of it.
But based on the other letter we visited recently, I mean, he knew that would change, didn't he?
Yes, he knew that we were going to grow mighty because of our resource base. He rightly read that. Here's another thing he learned, and this comes from the same set of fundamental questions. He learned that if you try to cling to a perpetual constitution or perpetual law, if you lock yourself in as a country, you'll fail. That there has to be a dynamism in the basic way you go about business, or you can't succeed. You have to have a sustainable constitutional basis, and that's the big fight of our time. If you hear people talking today in the presidential election, they'll say, we don't need any jurists legislating from the bench. We need Supreme Court justices who will adhere to the Constitution that was written in 1787. Jefferson's view is, you're nuts. The Constitution of 1787 was great for that moment. That moment has passed. You must update your system, your software. If you're still running the original Windows, your computer doesn't work. You have to update your software because it gets rusty. Things you didn't expect turned out to be problems in it. New technologies have emerged, new social systems and problems have emerged. You must have some sort of reformist dynamism in your basic constitutional structure so that you can keep pace with enlightenment. And he wrote the famous letter, My Head and My Heart, which is also in this series in 1787. And he said, the worst thing we could ever do would be to create a sacrosanct constitution that we pretend is perpetual. It's not perpetual. Laws are not perpetual. Even the national debt is not perpetual. And then he went into this whole statistical thing about what is a generation and when does it canceled out and so on. Madison shredded that argument. Again, Jefferson kind of backed away after Madison shredded it. But Jefferson was saying one reason why France has collapsed is that they cling to an ancient constitution that no longer works for them. And when you do that, you're doomed. And look what's happened in the last 5 years, David. I mean, our Congress has been in paralysis at least for 5 years, while other countries are looking at immigration, energy policy, educational policy, their place in the world, etc. The United States is locked in paralysis because we're living with a software. And a lot of this is bad will, but it's partly the software. It just isn't working for us anymore. And so Jefferson's view is, well, tear it up. Create something new. Find a new software. You'll be happier. Your system cannot be sustained on the sacrosanct mythology of the Founding Fathers.
Does Jefferson stand alone as far as men from his era that were involved in government and thinking about government? Was there anybody who shared these ideas? Or you brought it up earlier, and I've read about it. People thought he was crazy.
People thought he would become a dangerous radical.
Yeah, a lot. And
it's amazing that he ever became president, if you think about it, how radical he had become.
it's, we look to our own times now and how crazy it is, and it's amazing whoever gets to be president gets there.
So who was like him? Madison, but in a much more realistic way.
Wasn't Madison much quieter about it?
And he was not a utopian. Madison's view was, let's cut the most idealistic program we can given the actual realities of life.
Utopian is a good word to use. I mean, so I just wanted to establish with your expertise, was there anybody else that was a utopian in the sense of Jefferson?
Well, John Taylor of Caroline was an agrarian utopian, but Jefferson regarded him as kind of a crackpot. Thomas Paine.
He was.
Paine was even, in some ways, more radical than Jefferson. He was a feminist. He argued for welfare and a social safety net for national health care. I mean, Paine is a modern liberal in our sense of the term, much more liberal than Jefferson. Jefferson is a systemic guy. Jefferson's view is...
What do you mean by that?
He wants to fine-tune the software so that it works.
Okay.
So what happens today when you have New Orleans or Detroit or Flint where you basically have, or some Indian reservations, the Pine Ridge, where you have human beings born accidentally into life who lead lives of incredible degradation with respect to the white people who live down the road. What do you do? What's the answer to this? Jefferson's view is, I know you don't want to talk about it, but you have to talk about it. You have to figure out what you're going to do about this. I don't think he would like the New Deal and the Great Society programs because Jefferson's an empowerment man. How do I make sure that Lakota Indian can thrive? Not how can I lift him, but how can I help him thrive? What I love about Jefferson is not his answers. I love that he's asking the questions, David, because you think Hamilton was asking these questions? Hamilton's view was, if they are not making money, they're probably not working hard enough. And he even said that the country belonged to the wise, the rich, and the well-born. Jefferson's saying, wait a minute. If X isn't thriving, then why can Y and Z? Jefferson's asking the questions that any responsible statesman should be asking. And the fact that these are not asked in our time, I give Bernie Sanders a lot of credit for raising these questions. Someone like Donald Trump is surfing on the anger without asking the questions of what you do about this, how you settle the anger. Bernie Sanders says, I know where the anger comes from. It's because the system doesn't work. It's rigged. It's rigged for the rich. It's rigged for the Koch brothers. It's rigged by Citizens United. It's rigged by Mrs. Clinton taking gigantic speaking fees from companies that she then denounces from the stage. Which is it, Mrs. Clinton? His view is, you have to face this problem. And we waited so long that now the remedy is not going to be fun. It's going to be brutal. But we have to do it before it gets even more brutal. The thing about America, though, is that there are two things. One is the unbelievable wealth of America means that most poor people are better off than most poor people have ever been in history. And the mythology of America is the mythology of success. And so even people who are victims of American life are on board as cheerleaders for the mythology of success.
We are doing some things as a nation. I mean, I remember trying to think the last administration, I think it was the Clinton administration, when the minimum wage was hiked. And it was doom and gloom, but it ended up being a great boost to the economy. And that's one of the parts of the Democratic platform is to raise the minimum wage. Maybe that's not exactly what Jefferson was talking about, but it's something.
Okay, and I agree. I'm not trying to sound doom and gloom here, but take the minimum wage. I'll tell you what, you lower your income to the minimum wage and live on it for a year. You could not do it.
I could.
No.
I could.
I want to see that.
Do I have to?
I want you. Don't
I know anybody could if they had to.
No, you are wrong.
You just wouldn't buy any new books.
Now, forget
you might
books.
Walk a lot. You might not eat as much expensive good food.
I challenge you to add up what the minimum wage is.
Yeah. Well, your point is made, and I may be inaccurate in my response. My point is that is a major redistribution movement.
I like what one of the people who seconded Mrs. Clinton's nomination said about the Chelsea rules. If it's not good enough for Chelsea, if it's good enough for Chelsea, why shouldn't it be the standard for everybody? There's a difference between minimum wage and living wage. So you tell me what your minimum wage is. I'm not asking you to do it, but everyone who's listening to this program, write down what you think your living wage is. Is it $47,000? Is it $147,000?
But you're dodging my point. My point is movement in the correct direction according to Jefferson.
Yes, I mean, in my opinion, yes, of course. But we do a safety net bandage rather than face the Bernie Sanders questions. And I'm not a Bernie guy, as you know. But I really respect him for raising the questions.
But it's incremental change to get to that place, and it has to go bit by bit by bit. This isn't easy. Democracy's a mess.
In Norway, oil is owned by the state. Mm-hmm. In America, oil is owned by the person who happens to be on top of that land if they kept the oil rights, the mineral rights.
Right.
In Norway, no one pays a dime to go to college. In European countries, people don't pay to go to college. any more than we pay to go through 7th grade because the state believes it's in our interest
And of course it
to
is.
lift everybody.
Of course it is.
But in America, you don't have to be a fan of Elizabeth Warren to know that we have a colossal student debt crisis.
Right.
All I'm saying is that I like your view that we're working on it. We're working on it. It's gradual. But I would
I'm not sure what it is, but hanging around with you these days, I just have to be optimistic.
I am optimistic. I want us to do what Jefferson is saying. This is why I love Jefferson. He writes to Madison and he says, you know what? You have to have this discussion. And I say to anyone who's listening, give me what you think is your living wage and then look at the minimum wage and ask yourself how you're going to reduce your income by that amount to live what we now regard as a minimum wage. And even that is controversial.
I will bet you there are a number of people listening right now who do live on minimum.
I want to
or
hear
close
from
to
them.
it. Yeah, and
It is almost impossible in this country to live on that wage.
that's when I start saying we are spoiled. What do we need to survive?
Let's go back to Jefferson. He writes a letter about perpetual
And
constitutions.
don't get me wrong. I'm just trying to make a point here, okay?
My point, look, usually you're the more pessimistic about these things.
I know I can't do it around you. You're like,
I'm saying that the system is pretending to solve problems that it's not genuinely attempting to solve.
government moves very slowly.
The people would move faster than their elected officials are willing to move.
And Jefferson would have them do that.
Yes, because our representative system should be responsive to these needs. And over again, we're told to settle down, wait, it's coming, it's gradual, we're doing what we can, this is how the system works. And you know what? Life sucks for about 70 million people.
Oh my. Well, listen, we have to say goodbye.
I want to hear what our listeners think of this.
We have to say goodbye for this week. But what's up next in the Jefferson 101 series?
Well, now he comes back, so now he's the first Secretary of State.
And that will be fun.
And guess who he meets? Alexander Hamilton. Wow. You know, Mrs. Clinton quoting Alexander Hamilton. Really, Mrs. C?
Oh, come on.
Not a single reference to Mr. Jefferson, Mrs. C. We'll see you all next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.